Hey y'all, I'm Jamie13Horror. So I already covered this story on my TikTok, but I wasn't able to get all the details in the short time span I was given. This story was so grotesque and so disturbing. I felt like I was doing the victims an injustice by not giving the full details of this case. This is about one of Japan's most horrific serial killers, Tsutomu Miyazaki, also known as the Otaku Killer. One thing that makes Miyazaki so disturbing is how he would taunt his victims' parents. He was born prematurely in August of 1962 with a birth defect that made him unable to move his wrists properly, like bending them back and forth and such. So Miyazaki spent most of his childhood alone because of the bullying he received from his peers for his deformity. He was also very shy and had trouble making friends. He didn't participate in any school activities, never went out to social events. He was completely secluded and on his own. In photographs of himself, he is seen hiding his hands. He didn't want anyone to see his deformed wrists. Despite his wrist deformity, he was very passionate about art, especially drawing. He spent a lot of his younger years drawing comics. Despite not being social, he was a very successful student. He was a star student with high hopes of becoming a teacher. But as time went on, Miyazaki's grades plummeted. No one knows exactly what made him stop putting so much effort into school, or why he stopped being passionate about his grades. He was not able to get into the university that he had originally picked, and instead went to a local junior college. He ended up studying to become a photo technician instead of a teacher. Miyazaki's family was actually quite influential in Tokyo. Miyazaki's father owned the newspaper. He was expected to take over his father's job once his father retired, but he showed zero interest in doing so. Miyazaki was completely convinced that his parents only cared about his academic career and what would be his financial status. He assumed they only cared about his material success, which caused him to totally shun his family. The only person that he didn't shun was his grandfather. Miyazaki said that his grandfather was the only person he felt truly cared about his happiness. He said he felt like his younger sister despised him and had a weak relationship with his older sister. In college is when things started to get interesting for Miyazaki. He started exhibiting strange behavior. He was caught taking up the skirt photos of girls as they played tennis. He developed a deep obsession with pornographic magazines. The pornography became very boring to him very quickly. And he said, because Japanese pornography blacks out the most important part. It was in 1984 that Miyazaki started seeking out child pornography. He did so because Japanese pornography only censored pubic hair, not the actual genitals. So, with children not having pubic hair, he was able to view everything. Though he lived with his mother, father, and sisters, he spent most of his time with his grandfather. He recalled at one point he confided into his grandfather about thoughts of committing suicide, and his grandfather was the only person who helped him through it. But then, in 1988, everything changed. Miyazaki's grandfather had passed. And in Tsutomu Miyazaki's mind, the worst thing that could have possibly happened. Looking back, investigators believe this is what caused Miyazaki to become the monster that he did. It's unknown whether he had this disturbance inside of him all along, or if his grandfather dying is what just created this monster. It's hard to know because he didn't really speak to anyone. He didn't confide in anyone besides his grandfather. So we really don't know what things he ended up telling his grandfather and confiding in him. As much as we know is whatever Miyazaki has said himself. Family members said they noticed an immediate change in him after his grandfather's passing. He began spying on his younger sister while she was showering, then attacked them violently when they confronted him. At one point, he even violently attacked his mother. Miyazaki admitted himself that after his grandfather was cremated, he consumed some of his ashes. He said he did this in order to feel closer to his grandfather and distance himself more from his family. In August of 1988, just one day after his 26th birthday, Miyazaki abducted 4-year-old Mari Kono. According to Miyazaki, he approached her while she was outside and led her back to his car, and then simply drove off. He then drove her out to a secluded area west of Tokyo. It was a heavily wooded area, where he then parked his car under a bridge and then sat there in silence with her for 30 minutes. They just sat in silence and waited when suddenly Miyazaki attacked the young girl. First, he murdered her. Then he stripped her of all her clothing and then committed necrophilia with her corpse. Keep in mind, she was only 4 years old. He then carefully placed her naked body in the woods and left her there. For several weeks, he let the body decompose in the woods, though he would come back and check on it periodically. Eventually, the more she decomposed, the more fragile she became, which made it easier for him to remove her hands and feet. He kept her hands and feet in his closet. They were found the day of his arrest. While Mari's family was frantically searching for her, Miyazaki called them. When they answered, he just breathed heavily on the other end of the phone. Weeks after the young girl's abduction, Miyazaki sent them a horrific package in the mail. It was a box that contained ashes, a photograph of what Mari was wearing the day she was abducted, several small teeth, and a postcard reading the message, Mari cremated, bones, investigate, prove. In October of 1988, Miyazaki abducted a second little girl, 7-year-old Masami Yoshizawa. She spotted her walking home alone. He pulled over in his car and offered her a ride. She accepted. She was only 7 years old. She didn't know any better. Then he did to Masami the exact same thing that he did to Mari. He drove her to the same secluded area out by the woods, sat with her in the car under the bridge, and then murdered her, and once again committed necrophilia on the 7-year-old little girl's corpse. He left her corpse naked in the woods. He took her clothing with him. By this time, the parents of young girls in this area were absolutely panicking. They didn't know if their child could become next. Within the next 8 months, Miyazaki would attack 2 more little girls. 4-year-old Erika Namba. She was abducted while walking home alone. Miyazaki pulled up next to her in his car and offered her a ride home. But 4-year-old Erika refused, so he forced her into the car. He then forced 4-year-old Erika to undress herself. He then took photos of her and murdered her the exact same way that he did the other 2 little girls. After she was murdered, he tied her hands and feet together, which was different than the other 2 girls he had killed prior. Rather than leaving her body in the woods like the other 2 as well, he placed her on a sheet in his trunk. He then drove her body to an abandoned parking lot where he dumped it there and discarded of her clothes in the nearby woods. Like Mari's family, Erika's family received a disturbing package in the mail as well. Pieced together from magazine clippings, it read, Erika, cold, cough, throat, rest, death. Miyazaki's final victim was 5-year-old Ayako Nomoto in June of 1989. Just the same as before, he convinced her to let him give her a ride home. And just like with Erika, he forced her to undress so he could photograph her naked. He then murdered her in the same way he did the other 3 girls. But instead of disposing of her body in the woods or a parking lot like the others, he took hers home. For the next 2 days, he repeatedly had sex with her corpse. She was only 5 years old. He would photograph her naked corpse and then masturbate to them. He then dismembered Ayako's body and drank her blood. He even tried flesh from her hands and feet. As soon as she began to decompose, Miyazaki lost interest. He dismembered what was left of her body and disposed of the pieces around Tokyo, including a cemetery, a public toilet, and the nearby woods. He began to fear that police would find the body parts he had hidden in the cemetery, so he returned to retrieve them and kept those dismembered parts at his home, in the box Miyazaki had sent to her parents. Miyazaki watched this announced on the news and decided he would send Mari's family a confession. In his letter, he described what it was like having young Mari's body decompose. It said, "Before I knew it, the child's body had gone rigid. I wanted to cross her hands over her breasts, but they wouldn't budge. Pretty soon, the body gets red spots all over it. Big red spots. After a while, the body is covered in stretch marks. It was so rigid before, but now it feels like it's full of water. And it smells, oh how it smells, like nothing you've ever smelled in this whole wide world." Miyazaki was caught during his 5th kidnapping attempt. July 1989. Miyazaki spotted 2 sisters playing in their front yard together. He managed to separate the younger sister from the older sister and dragged the youngest one to his car. The older sister ran to go get their father. The father then found Miyazaki with his daughter nude in his car as he photographed her. The father attacked him and was able to get his daughter out of the vehicle, but Miyazaki got away. He ran on foot, leaving his vehicle behind. However, when he circled back to pick up his car, police were waiting for him. After his arrest, police organized a search of his apartment and his vehicle. What they found in them was incredibly disturbing. In his apartment, police found over 5,000 tapes, some of anime and slasher films. Some were homemade videos of him sexually abusing corpses. They found the photographic evidence of all 4 of his victims. He also found pieces of their clothing. And they also discovered the body of his 4th victim, decomposing in his bedroom closet. Her hands were missing because Miyazaki had eaten them. During his trial, Miyazaki remained unusually calm. Police noted that Miyazaki seemed completely indifferent about his arrest, and he didn't seem to care at all about the horrific things that he had done, and not even once acted like he cared about the sentence he could possibly be facing. He answered the questions he was asked calmly, cooperated completely, and seemed completely rational and sane with all his thinking. Well, almost completely sane. When he was asked about his crimes, he would blame it on the Rat Man, the alter ego that lived inside of him, who forced him to do terrible things. He was studied by psychoanalysts. They pinpointed that his disturbing behavior was from a lack of connection with his parents. They also said because he had no connection with his family, that he turned to a fantasy world, including manga and slasher films. When all of this became public, Miyazaki's parents completely disowned him. His father refused to pay for anything dealing with the trial. And because of the shame that his father felt, he committed suicide in 1994. When the trial went public, that's when he was deemed the otaku killer, which has a meaning kind of like nerd, and one with obsessive interests, such as manga and slasher films. Enthusiasts of the art form, though, completely rejected this label. They wanted no association with this monster of a human being. Miyazaki's trial drug out for 7 years. He was examined over and over and over again to see if he was sane or not. Finally, after 7 grueling years of these young girls' families wanting justice, the court deemed Miyazaki mentally sound, which meant he was eligible for the death penalty. But it wasn't until 2008 that Miyazaki would be punished for his crimes completely. On June 17th, 2008, Miyazaki was hanged for his horrific crimes. I'm glad that I was able to cover everything in this video that I wasn't able to get to on TikTok, because it makes it that much more horrific when the victims are innocent children. And while he did not murder an abundance of people, because of how graphic and disgusting and foul his crimes were, Miyazaki is hands down one of the most disturbed, disgusting serial killers I have ever read about. He definitely isn't one that you forget. Even in just the short amount that I could fit in my TikTok, people went to the comments and said how disturbed they were. And the repeat question was, who could do this to children? And honestly, I don't know what kind of person could do that to a child. So after hearing this disturbing case, I would love to know y'all's thoughts. So leave a comment below and let me know what you think.